In this example, we're going to be looking at expanding algebraic expressions with negative factors. So we're going to follow our same steps in the same process that we have been while using our distributive property, except now you'll notice that the outside factor is going to be a negative. So this expression here is a negative 3 times the sum of a negative 2/3 a and 1/5. We follow our same process of taking our outside factor and multiplying it by both parts inside. That is our distributive property there. So we're left with a negative 3 times a negative 2/3 a plus a negative 3 times 1/5. And we're multiplying fractions by integers again. So I'm just going to multiply this 3 by the top part. 3 times 2 is 6. So that is 6 over 3a, or 6/3 a. And now we got to remember our sign rules again. With negatives and positives. Anytime we have the same sign, so if we have a positive times a positive, or a negative times a negative, that leaves us with a positive. When we multiply with different signs, if we had a negative times a positive, or a positive times a negative, that will leave us with a negative. So for this first part, we had a negative times a negative, so that'll stay positive. Plus, on our second part of expanding, we have a negative 3 times 1/5. That would become a negative 3 over 5, or a negative 3/5. 6/3 could reduce to 2a. Because it's plus a negative, to get rid of the parentheses and just kind of make it look neater, I'm going to write this as minus, and then that will be 3/5 is already simplified. I cannot do anything with that. So to expand this expression of negative 3 times the sum of a negative 2/3 a and 1/5, it was simplified to 2a minus 3/5. For example B here, we notice that there's a negative sign outside of the parentheses. And there's two things that this could mean. Earlier in the year, we looked at another way of reading a negative as the opposite of. So I could read this as the opposite of the difference of negative 4/10 k and 2 5/10. The other thing we could do is when you have a negative sign outside, it's kind of the same as having a variable without a coefficient. There's actually a 1 there. So I could rewrite this actually as a negative 1 times the difference of a negative 4/10 k and 2 5/10. And just for visual purposes, I'm going to keep it as this negative 1. I'm going to go through it this way so we can actually see what we're multiplying. And then we'll come back and we'll look at it this way up top. So we want to distribute first, and we have a negative 1 times a negative 4/10 k. And now because this is a minus sign here, what I'm going to do is rewrite this as plus a negative. So I'm going to rewrite this as plus a negative, and that allows me to bring down my plus sign here. And now we're going to multiply, because this became plus a negative, that's going to be a negative 2 5/10. So this will be a negative 1 times a negative 2 5/10. So we have negative times negative in this first part. That's going to become 4/10 k. And then we have negative times negative, which becomes a positive 2 5/10. So this got rewritten as 4/10 k plus 2 5/10. If we go back to the way the problem was originally written, and we read this negative sign as the opposite of, well, if I wanted to write this as the opposite of a negative 4/10 k would be 4/10 k, and the opposite of a negative 2/5, which is my next term there, is a positive 2/5. For our last example we're going to look at with expanding algebraic expressions with negative factors, we have a negative 1/3 times the sum of p and 2q. So we have that same setup again of our distributive property. We take the outside factor and multiply it by both parts inside. So we're left with a negative 1/3 times p. And again, when a variable is by itself, there's actually a number 1 in front of it. So I'm going to write that as 1p, so I know what I'm multiplying my third by, plus a negative third times 2q. So anything times 1 equals itself. So when we multiply a negative third by 1, it's a negative times a positive. So that'll give us a negative 1/3 p plus, now we have a negative times a positive again, which is going to give us a negative, and that would be 2/3 q once we multiply. And I'm just going to finish this by rewriting it as subtraction, just to get rid of those parentheses at the end. So I'm going to rewrite this as a negative 1/3 p minus 2/3 q.